The hold smelled different from the rest of the ship. Aishe had catalogued the Arvezer by sections over 3 days, the way she had once catalogued the dialects of market towns along the Danube. Her lungs noticed before her mind did. The bridge smelled of recycled metal and the faint chemical sweetness the ventilation system pushed through every corridor, an odor hovering between anise and copper. The corridor outside engineering smelled of heat, the dry scorch of systems working harder than they were designed to. The cell blocks they had all woken up in still carried the residual bite of ozone and industrial solvent, a smell she associated with the first 6 hours of terror and would associate with it for the rest of her life. The hold where the three waited smelled like rain on warm stone. She didn't know what produced it, some combination of their skin chemistry and the slightly different humidity they required, which Dika had adjusted 2 days ago by isolating the hold's environmental controls and setting them to a profile the three had selected themselves. The adjustment had taken 11 minutes and involved Deka lying on her back under a console while Aishe relayed instructions through 5 combined words and a lot of pointing. The result was a space that felt, to Aishe, like the moment before a summer storm in the foothills of Transylvania, when the air thickened and the dust settled and everything alive went quiet because something was coming. She'd stood at the threshold now, carrying a tray. The tray held 4 portions of the synthesis matrix output, the compressed nutrient slabs that were technically food in the same way that a map was technically a country. 3 portions for them, 1 for her. She had learned on the second day that sharing the meal mattered. Eating together was a language act. It said, "I am here to stay for a while. I am not afraid of being close to you. I consider us the same kind of thing, at least for this purpose." Aishe did not made in a dozen languages in life before the cell. Some she had learned young, absorbing them the way children absorb weather. Romani from her mother, Hungarian from the market, German from the traders who wintered in the valley. Others she had learned by necessity, building them word by word, in rooms where not understanding could mean not surviving. She had learned the shapes of church Latin from a priest who sheltered her family for 3 nights and expected nothing in return except someone to talk to. She had learned enough Ottoman Turkish to lie convincingly at a checkpoint. She had learned the register of Bavarian German that meant a shopkeeper's wife was about to offer food instead of calling for the constable. Every language was a compromise. Every word in every language was a round thing trying to fit a square idea. The gap between the word and the meaning it circled, that was where the interesting part lived. That was where you found out what mattered to the people who spoke it, because the words they had invented told you what they had needed to name, and the words they hadn't told you what they had never encountered or could not bear to look at directly. She loved that gap. She had always loved it. She crossed the threshold into the hold. The 3 were arranged in a loose triangle on the far side of the space, which was roughly 12 meters square, and had been, based on the anchor points in the floor, a secondary cargo pen. The combine had stored them here. The anchor points had held restraints. Dika had removed the restraints on day 1, cutting through the composite bolts with a tool she'd found in the maintenance corridor and pronouncing them the most offensively overbuilt things I have ever seen, and I once watched a UN contractor install earthquake-rated hinges on a latrine door. The restraints were gone. The anchor points remained, flush with the deck, small circles of darker metal that the 3 had, without discussion, arranged themselves around rather than on top of. Aishe noticed this. She noticed what people chose not to touch. She lowered herself to the deck, setting the tray between herself and the nearest of the 3, the one she had begun thinking of as the eldest, though she had no evidence for this beyond the quality of attention they directed at her when she spoke. They attended to her the way someone compares what they are hearing to a very large internal catalog. The 3 watched her sit. Their eyes were the thing that had stopped her the first time, segmented, like kaleidoscopes made of polished obsidian, each facet catching the light at a slightly different angle so that the whole eye seemed to shift and refract as they moved. 7 facets in each eye, as near as she could count. The facets didn't blink simultaneously. They blinked in sequence, a ripple across the surface, so that at any given moment some portion of the eye was always watching. Their bodies were lean, angular, built on a frame that was neither bipedal nor anything else she had vocabulary for. Triple-jointed legs that folded in ways her knees actively refused to contemplate. Long torsos with a flexibility that suggested a spine made of many more segments than hers. 6 fingers on each hand, no, 7 on the left. She had miscounted the first time because the 7th was set further back, almost at the wrist, and operated independently. The scales covering their skin were small and iridescent, catching the hold's dim light and throwing it back in muted blues and greens, and, in the eldest's case, a deep amber that surfaced when they were still and faded when they moved. Beautiful. That was the word she kept arriving at and then questioning. They were beautiful the way a river was beautiful. Every part of them moved with a coherence that suggested deep time, long evolution, a species that had been exactly what it was for a very long time. She pushed one of the nutrient slabs toward the eldest. The eldest's 7-fingered hand moved over it, hovering, as if reading something from the surface that Aishe couldn't perceive. Then the hand descended. The slab was lifted. The eldest ate. Aishe ate her own. The session began. She had been approaching their language as a single-channel system because that was what she knew. Every human language she had encountered operated on one primary channel, sound. Yes, there were gestures, facial expressions, the pitch and rhythm of speech that carried meaning beyond the words, but those were supplementary. The core was acoustic. You opened your mouth and shaped air, and the shapes carried the code, and the listener decoded the shapes back into meaning. The 3 did not work this way. She had spent 2 previous sessions, short ones, 20 minutes each, establishing the food ritual and confirming the 30 combined words they shared, assuming that the vocalizations she was hearing were the language, and the posture shifts were body language, and the faint changes in the air she could feel but not see were environmental. She had been wrong on every count. Today she understood why. The eldest vocalized a combine word, kesh, which meant approximately unit or portion or this many. Simple, clear. Aishe knew this word, but as the eldest said it, the second of the 3, smaller, quicker in their movements, with scales that ran to deep blue, shifted the angle of their torso by precisely 3 degrees to the left, and raised their 7th finger. And the meaning changed. The vocalization kesh plus the torso shift plus the finger elevation meant something different from kesh alone. This many, which is not enough, and the insufficiency has consequences. Aishe stared. She vocalized kesh back experimentally. The 3 watched. She had no torso shift to add. She had no 7th finger. She had said this many, and they had received this many, and the difference between what she'd said and what the eldest had said was the difference between stating a number and telling a story about what the number meant. She tried the torso shift. She leaned left, approximately 3 degrees. The blue one's faceted eyes rippled, a blink pattern she hadn't seen before. Fast, all 7 facets cycling in sequence. Amusement, surprise. She failed the reaction and moved on. The 3rd of them, the quietest, the one whose scales were darkest, who had shown the most visible signs of nutritional deficit, and who had eaten first and most at every shared meal, made a sound. Low, sustained, with a harmonic undertone that Aishe could feel in her sternum before she could hear it with her ears, and the air changed, not a metaphor, not a feeling, an actual physical change, a shift in pressure or temperature, or some quality she didn't have a sensory name for. The fine hairs on her forearms rose. The space between her and the 3 felt briefly denser, as if the air had thickened by a degree she could perceive but not measure. Then it passed. The quiet one had said something. On a 3rd channel, Aishe sat very still. They were communicating on 3 channels simultaneously. She had access to 2 of them. the vocalization, which she could hear, and the postural layer, which she could see. The third was something she could not fully perceive. She could feel its edges. She could tell when it was active. She could not decode it. The honest thing to do was obvious. The temptation to pretend otherwise was equally obvious. She could nod and move on and work with the two channels she had, and the three might never confront her about it, and the bridge she was building would have a gap in its foundation that she knew about, and they knew about, and everyone would politely ignore. Or she assembled the combined words carefully. She had 45 now, a vocabulary barely adequate for freight management, hopelessly inadequate for what she was about to attempt, but it was what she had. Tal viz Kirchen Vorka, she said. The combine structure was clumsy, each word a blunt instrument, but the meaning held. I cannot hear all of what you say. The three went still, all three, a simultaneous cessation of movement so complete it was like watching statues remember they had been alive a moment ago. She continued there. Kirshinda, I hear this part. She pointed to her ear, then touched her throat, sound. She pointed to her eyes, then gestured at the elder's posture, sight. Then she held her forearms out, showing the fine hairs that had risen. She touched them. She shook her head. Vorka tel, I am learning. The silence stretched. The eldest's kaleidoscope eyes refracted light across 7 facets, each one catching and releasing it in sequence, and Aishe watched the ripple move from the outermost facet to the innermost, and she knew, with the bone-deep certainty that came from a lifetime of reading rooms for survival, that she had just passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. Dedades vocalized, 3 words in combine, spoken slowly and distinctly, paired with a postural shift that Aishe could now read as deliberate emphasis, both hands open, 7th fingers extended, torso inclined 4 degrees toward her. Vorka tel, keshida, I am learning, and then, good enough. The session's register changed after that. The three shifted from responding to her to teaching her, and the difference was immediate and unmistakable, like the difference between a merchant tolerating questions and a craftsman deciding to show an apprentice how the tool actually worked. They had been cargo longer than any of the humans. This emerged over the next 2 hours, built word by word from the shared combined vocabulary, cross-referenced against posture and context, and assembled it the way she had once assembled the story of a family she'd traveled with through the Carpathian passes, from the accumulation of small truths that, taken together, drew a map. The three had been on combined ships for, the time unit was imprecise, but working from the feeding cycle intervals she'd catalogued, at least 3 standard combined transit years, perhaps longer, long enough that their combined vocabulary was not the survival minimum Aishe had assembled from PA announcements and crisis exchanges. It was extensive. They knew freight terms she hadn't encountered, feeding cycle terminology, medical terms, a full sub-vocabulary for the procedures the combine performed on cargo, words for sedation and measurement and classification that Aishe recognized as the grammar of captivity refined to an administrative science. They had more combine than she did, substantially more, which meant the sessions didn't just run in one direction. As she taught them to read her postural cues, the human ones, the gestures and facial expressions that supplemented her speech, they taught her the combined words she was missing. The trade was balanced. The bridge grew from both banks simultaneously. Keshfor, inventory count, performed on cargo. Telkir, medical assessment, non-urgent. Da Shen, adequate, meeting threshold. The combine word for this will not generate a report. Vorshen, below threshold, will generate a report. The bureaucratic granularity was staggering. The combine had 14 words for different degrees of compliance and no word for gratitude. Aishe wrote everything down. Her vocabulary list had started as scratches on a strip of composite sheeting she'd peeled from a maintenance panel. Dika had found her a smoother surface, a section of the pale material the combine used for internal signage, blank on one side, rigid enough to take the pressure of the sharpened stylus Aishe had made from a broken restraint pin. The list was organized by category: operational terms, spatial terms, temporal terms, medical terms, emotional terms, a very short column, and now a new category she'd added this morning: relational terms, words for how things stood in relation to other things. The Combine had a rich vocabulary here because bureaucracy was, at its core, a system for defining relationships between entities. Primortes tahumat, what belonged where, which things were the same category and which were different. The three taught her kelthesh, the Combine term for a species cohort, a group of the same kind. The word carried no warmth, it was a sorting bin. Kelthesh, Aishe repeated, pointing at the three of them, then at herself. Two different bins. The eldest tilted their head, a gesture Aishe now understood as acknowledgement without agreement, the equivalent of, I hear you, and the truth is more complicated than that. The blue one made a sound that Aisha's new ear heard as a minor correction, two short notes, descending. A different word, the blue one repeated it with a postural shift, both hands flat, seventh fingers curled inward, a gesture Aishe had seen 3 times now and was beginning to read as intimacy or inclusion. A different word, something closer. Aishe felt the hairs on her arms rise again. The third channel, the quiet one, was contributing something she couldn't decode, but the shape of the contribution felt. Warm was not the right word, but warm was the closest she had. She asked the question at the start of the 4th hour. She had been building toward it, arranging the Combine words in her head the way she would arrange kindling before a fire. The structure had to be right, or the whole thing collapsed. The Combine had a grammatical construction for identity queries used in cargo processing. Quel verdai, approximately, what is the designation? She had heard it on the ship's PA during the initial captivity, spoken by an automated system to each new arrival. It was impersonal, bureaucratic, a form to be filled. She didn't want to use it. The question she wanted to ask was not, what is your designation? It was, what do you call yourselves? She didn't have the Combine words for that. The Combine didn't distinguish between the two concepts because the Combine had never needed to. Designation and identity were the same thing in a system where you existed only insofar as you were classified. So she built it from parts. Quel verda, she said, first establishing the frame. Then she added, carefully, datel kir, which was not a standard Combine construction, but which she specifically, precisely hoped, would shift the meaning from, what is the designation assigned to you, to what is the name you carry. The three looked at each other. At a glance, they looked at each other in a way that involved all 3 channels simultaneously: sound, posture, and the third thing that made the air thicken and Aishe's skin prickle. The exchange lasted perhaps 4 seconds and contained, she was certain, more information than she could have conveyed in an hour of speech. Then the eldest turned back to her and spoke their name. The sound was layered. That was the only word. It began with a fricative that Aishe's ear could track, a hissing onset like wind through canyon rock. Then it dropped into a register that was partly vocalization and partly something her chest resonated with rather than her eardrums, a harmonic that she felt in her ribs and her jaw and the hollows behind her eyes. Underneath that, the third channel pulsed, and her forearm hairs rose and stayed risen, and the air between them was thick with something she could sense the presence of, but not the content. The posture component was equally complex. The eldest torso shifted through 3 distinct angles during the name, and the 7th finger traced a path in the air that was clearly a symbol or glyph with meaning she could see but not read. The whole thing lasted about 2 seconds. Aishe opened her mouth and closed it. She had been learning languages her entire life. She had bent her throat and tongue around sounds that bore no resemblance to any word she'd grown up speaking. She had learned to make the click consonants of a language she'd heard once, spoken by a traveler from so far south the stars looked different. She had learned to shape the guttural fricatives of the German dialect spoken in the mining valleys where her family had wintered for 2 years. This was different, she tried. What came out was a reasonable approximation of the fricative onset, the wind through canyon part. The harmonic drop was where she lost it. Her throat produced a sound, but it was the wrong sound, flat where theirs had been dimensional, a line drawing of a sculpture. The blue one's eyes rippled, fast, all 7 facets. The quiet one made a sound, low, brief, that Aishe read as gentle rather than corrective. More like not yet. She tried again. Better. The fricative was accurate. She found a way to approximate the harmonic shift by dropping her voice into her chest and letting the resonance build in her sternum rather than her throat. It wasn't the same sound, but it was, she thought, the same shape, like a sketch that captured the proportions, if not the detail. The postural component was beyond her. Her spine didn't articulate that way. Her hands had 5 fingers each, and the 7th was doing something she couldn't replicate. She produced the second attempt and watched their reaction. The eldest tilted their head, the acknowledgement without agreement gesture. The blue one's eyes rippled again, slower this time. The quiet one was still. Close, still short. Aishe sat with it. She turned the sound over in her memory, examining it the way she would examine a word in a new language, not trying to reproduce it perfectly, but trying to find its center of gravity. Every name had a center of gravity, the syllable or sound or rhythm that, if you got it right, made the rest of the name recognizable even if everything around it was wrong. The fricative onset was the anchor, the hissing wind canyon sound. It was unique. She had not heard anything like it in any human language or in the combined vocabulary. If she held that and simplified everything else into shapes her voice could actually make, she tried a third time, the fricative, sharp and clean, then a simplified version of the harmonic drop, 2 notes, descending, her chest voice doing the work her missing resonance chamber couldn't. The third channel component she acknowledged by going silent for a beat, where it would have been a pause that said something goes here that I cannot make, but I know it exists. It came out sounding approximately like Ikran. The name took 3 attempts. The third attempt was wrong, but it was the wrong shape they accepted, which meant it was close enough to carry meaning. That was the definition of a name that worked. The eldest was still for a long time. 3 seconds. 5. The kaleidoscope eyes did not ripple. Every facet was fixed on Aishe. Then the torso inclined 4 degrees toward her, and both hands opened, and the 7th fingers extended, and the quiet one produced a sustained low tone that made the air thicken one final time, and the blue one repeated the sound Aishe had made, Ikran, in a voice that was clearly an imitation of her imitation, a mirror of a mirror, and the fact that they were willing to hear themselves through her approximation was yay. Aishe blinked hard. Once, she wrote it down. Her stylus moved across the pale composite surface, and the phonetic notation was careful and precise, and beside it she wrote, in the Romani script her mother had taught her, their name for themselves. My version, they allowed it, Ikran. The session lasted another hour after the naming. Aishe was tired in a way that had nothing to do with her body. Language construction at this depth was cognitive labor most people never encountered because most people never needed to build a communication system from raw components with a species that processed information on 3 channels when you only had access to 2. Her head ached. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. She had held them still through worse, but the muscles in her jaw were sore from producing sounds her mouth was never designed for. The Ikran, the name felt right already, felt like it had always been there, continued to teach her combined vocabulary during the final hour, and she continued to teach them her postural cues, and the bridge between them grew wider and more stable, and by the time the ship's lighting shifted to the dimmer cycle that Dika had programmed to approximate a day-night rhythm, Aishe had 63 combined words in her catalog and a functional, if limited, ability to conduct a conversation with beings whose communication system she could only partially access. It was at the end, in the dimming light, that the eldest asked, 2 combined words, paired with a postural shift as she now understood as a question carrying weight. Vorkastad, where going? As she considered the honest answer, she considered the reassuring answer, she considered the strategic answer. She chose honest. She had always chosen honest when it mattered, because lies built bridges that collapsed under load, and she was building something that needed to hold. I don't know where, she said, using the combine structure and supplementing with her own gestures, one hand open, palm up, the gesture for uncertainty she'd established in the first session. I know which direction, she pointed, a human gesture, probably meaningless to them, but she paired it with the combined spatial term kelda, away from the ones who built the cells. The eldest processed this. The blue one and the quiet one shifted, a micro-exchange on all three channels that Aishe caught the edges of but couldn't decode. Then the eldest responded. It was a long vocalization, 10 seconds, perhaps 12. It used combined words Aishe knew, and combined words she didn't, and something that was not combined at all. Fragments of their own language, the one with three channels, woven into the combined framework, like colored thread through rough canvas. The postural shifts were complex and sustained. The third channel was active. Aishe's forearm hairs were risen for the full duration. She understood perhaps a third of it. The rest was shape without content. She could feel its emotional weight, its direction, its urgency, but the specific meaning was out of reach. She wrote it down, every combined word she'd caught, every postural shift she'd observed, the timing and duration of the third channel activity, phonetic notation for the non-combined sounds, carefully marked as untranslated. She would work on it later. She would work on it until she understood it, or until she ran out of time, whichever came first. She stood, her knees protested. 4 hours on a metal deck with no cushion was 4 hours on a metal deck with no cushion, regardless of what species you were learning to talk to. She gathered the tray, now empty. She inclined her torso 4 degrees toward the eldest, mimicking the gesture of acknowledgement the Ikran used. The eldest repeated the gesture back, precisely. Aishe left the hold. The corridor was quiet. The shift that Quintus had organized, the second of 4, running on a cycle that approximated the Roman military watch system, because Quintus was Quintus, and the man could not help building order any more than Aishe could help learning languages, was 2 hours from changeover. Most of the ship was asleep or pretending to be. She leaned against the wall outside the hold and wrote. The phonetic journal was filling up. 3 days of vocabulary acquisition, pronunciation guides, grammatical notes, and now the Ikran naming notation and the untranslated response. She wrote by the corridor's dim amber lighting, the stylus moving in precise strokes, and the ship hummed around her with the bass vibration of systems built to carry freight across interstellar distances, and she realized, not afraid. Tycho was fearless. That was his territory, and she did not trespass on it. She knew the danger. The recovery team was still out there, and 600 people were depending on a ship none of them fully understood, and the nutrient slabs were adequate in the way that a tourniquet was adequate. It stopped the bleeding, but it was not medicine. But she was doing the thing she was for. She had spent her whole life building bridges between things that were not designed to connect, languages that didn't share a root, peoples that didn't share a history, markets where she spoke 3 tongues and none of them were hers. She had thought it was circumstance, the product of a life lived in the margins, where you learned to translate or you didn't survive. She was beginning to think it was what she was for. She closed the journal and pushed off the wall and walked toward the bridge. Quintus was at the command station, studying something on the main display with the expression he wore when he was imposing Roman organizational logic on a problem that predated Rome by several thousand years. A Tory stood at the secondary console, one hand resting on its edge, his posture a stillness so complete it looked architectural. Dika was visible through the engineering corridor, her legs sticking out from under the mass balance console where she spent most of her waking hours. Sivu was asleep in the corner, sitting upright with his back against the bulkhead and his arms crossed, because the man slept the way he fought, ready to stand up and hit something at any moment. Aishe approached Quintus. "Their name," she said. She used the Kanban word kelvor, name, designation, because Quintus had learned 11 Kanban terms in 3 days through sheer disciplined repetition, and this was one of them. Then she added the human word ikrin. Quintus raised an eyebrow. It was, for Quintus, the equivalent of a standing ovation. "Say it again," he said, in the Latin accented Kanban that was, Aishe had to admit, impressively precise for a man who considered alien language acquisition a logistical task rather than an act of cultural communion. Ikrin, doseis, he repeated it. His pronunciation was flat, Roman, absolutely devoid of the fricative's canyon wind quality. It sounded like a word for a type of masonry. "Close enough," Aishe said. Hattori turned from his console. He did not ask Aishe to repeat the name. He had heard it once, and she knew, from watching the man for 3 days, that once was sufficient. His mouth shaped the word silently, testing it, and she saw his throat move through 2 adjustments before he produced it aloud. His version was better than Quintus's. He approached it as a student approaches a master's technique, with precise attention to the details that made it what it was, rather than what it approximated. "Ikrin," Hattori said. The fricative was clean. Osha allowed herself a nod. From the engineering corridor, Dika's voice carried with the clarity of someone speaking from underneath heavy equipment. "Ikrin, got it," adding to the manifest. From the corner, Savihel opened one eye, said something in Norse that contained the word's approximate shape buried inside what sounded like a commentary on the difficulty of pronouncing anything that didn't involve hitting someone, and closed the eye again. She waited for the comedy to settle. Then she delivered the second thing. "They have been on combine ships for years," she said. She looked at Quintus. "They know about other harvested species, more of their kind, not on this ship, held elsewhere. They know a location." The bridge went quiet. Quintus looked at Hattori. The look lasted 2 seconds and contained, in its compressed Roman economy, a full strategic conversation about priorities, resources, risk, and the mathematics of deciding how much danger you could afford to accept on behalf of people you had just learned the name of. "Later," Quintus said. "First we survived the next 6 days." The Senkenhand moved on the console edge, one finger tapping, twice. Aishe knew him well enough now to read it. Acknowledgement that later had just been entered on a ledger, and that Hattori would be the one tracking when the debt came due. Aishe returned to her place at the communication station. She set the phonetic journal beside her console, open to the untranslated response from the eldest Ikrin. The combined words she'd caught were there, circled. Keish, unit/portion. Kelda, away from. Vorshen, below threshold. And 3 she couldn't translate yet that sat in the middle of the passage like stones in a river, the current of meaning flowing around them. She would crack them. Tomorrow. Or the day after, or the day after that. She would sit on the metal deck and eat the nutrient slabs and listen on 2 channels and acknowledge the third and build the bridge 1 word at a time, because that was what she was for. And the bridge was not finished, and the people on the other side of it had just trusted her with their name. The Arvid flew on. Aishe read her notes.